From Deloitte Tax, welcome to the Tax News and Views podcast. In this series, we talk to specialists from Deloitte about the latest business issues and developments. I'm Carrie Falkenhayn, your host for Tax News and Views. And today we are continuing our discussion on the sustainability incentives that were introduced as part of the Inflation Reduction Act back in August of 2022. One of the notable features about the act was the introduction of the ability for an organization that originates credits under the act through their sustainability activities to be able to transfer or sell those credits to other parties. This can be an attractive feature when the originator of the credit may not be a tax-paying entity, which could be for any number of reasons. These credits are generally sold at a discount, which is attractive to buyers to reduce their own tax costs. And there's been a lot of developments in this area since the legislation was first passed. So joining me today are two Deloitte specialists in the credits and incentives area. I'm joined by Jessica Zoyne and Ben Bissonnette, and they're going to give us some insights. And so I will start with Ben, and maybe just take us through how does purchasing tax credits work at a high level?
Yeah, absolutely, Carrie. So before I talk about how purchasing credits works, I want to introduce why this market exists. And the primary reason is that the projects that are eligible for these credits aren't always developed by organizations that can efficiently utilize the credits. And although there are options for carrying back credits or carrying forward credits, most of these organizations do not have tax liability in prior years or do not expect tax liabilities in future years that they'll be able to use the credits to offset. And so in order for them to recognize the value of these credits, they have to sell them to a third party. And thankfully, the IRA made that process much simpler. The process for purchasing credits is engaging with a third-party seller or someone in the middle, a syndicator or a broker. You perform due diligence. They provide you with what's called required minimum documentation. Eventually, you execute a purchase and sale agreement. And then on your tax returns for the year that the credits are purchased and generated, you'll have what's called a transfer election statement on both the buyer and the seller's tax return.
And so, Jessica, let's get you into the discussion. So can you offset your entire tax liability with the purchase of credits?
So you can offset your whole tax liability with purchase credits. There are a few tax credit utilization rules to consider prior to making these purchases. So first, these tax credits are all general business tax credits subject to the limitations to offset only up to 75% of your aggregate corporate income tax and your corporate alternative minimum tax liability. Then if you're subject to BEAT, consider that BEAT tax liability can be offset only up to 80% of your tax credits through 2024. And then after 2024 and beginning in 2025, you can't offset your BEAT tax liability by any tax credits. And then finally, if you're subject to Pillar 2, then that top off tax, it does provide favorable treatment to marketable transferable tax credits, MTTCs, which are the 6418 transfer credits compared to the other tax credits of everything else, but they will decrease your adjusted covered taxes or the numerator of your ETR by the discount paid on the purchase.
So there's some limitations, Ben, but can you walk us through any other benefits of purchasing the credits?
Yeah, sure. So the primary benefit of purchasing credits is receiving a discount on the purchase price versus the value of the credit. And so if you purchase a credit, for example, at 95 cents for $1 of credit, well, you're saving 5 cents for each $1 of credit that you purchase. Those credits that you buy can be utilized against quarterly estimated payments, and you just need to go through those mechanics prior to recognizing the benefit. And they will ultimately have a positive impact on your effective tax rate. A couple of the other benefits include potentially supporting clean or low carbon technologies, if that's something that a company has interest or goals towards achieving. And compared to what was the predecessor as tax equity investing, these transactions are very simple and they don't have complex accounting. There's not complex structuring. You have to perform your diligence. You have to make sure you're buying credits that are relatively low risk and that you're vetting those risks. But compared to many other investment opportunities, these transactions are fairly straightforward.
So you can save in your overall tax. Money's out the door by the discount. It helps you with your estimated payments. It can also support your organization's efforts around clean energy. So all those things sound great and being simple, more simple than traditional tax equity investing. Jessica, what are some of the risks though? And I heard Ben mention due diligence. Talk a little bit more about that.
Yeah, so generally these transactions, when you find a opportunity that's right for you, then you would go through a diligence process to mitigate some of the risks that we see from these transactions. But those risks that should be considered prior to entering into any purchase and sale agreements for these tax credits are a disallowance risk or a recapture risk for certain credits, determining the creditworthiness of your counterparty, and then any audit compliance considerations. So if we dig into a little bit about the disallowance risk or recapture risk, the IRS could come back and say that the tax credits claimed weren't valid, or maybe if you're claiming an investment tax credit that's subject to recapture, if that property ceases to operate within the recapture period, those credits could be clawed back by the IRS. With regards to creditworthiness of your counterparty, within the purchase and sale agreements, the seller will typically indemnify the buyer for any credit losses, penalties, fees, interest associated with these penalties, fees, and credit losses. But the seller actually having the balance sheet and the creditworthiness to make good on that payment is a key risk that we're identifying. And then finally, contest rights and audit compliance are not necessarily a risk, but an administrative burden to be aware of. The buyer is subject to audit, whereas the seller has the documentation to support the purchase tax credits. So generally, the buyer's goal is to place the financial risk of an IRS challenge on the seller through that indemnity. And the IRS is actually auditing the buyer, which can cause those contest rights within the negotiated purchase and sale agreements to be a heavily negotiated section.
Well, it sounds like there are risks, but there are some strategies to mitigate those risks. Ben, you want to take us a little bit deeper on that?
Yeah, absolutely. As Jeff lined out, there are a few risks. Many of them are manageable or mitigatable. What's really important is if you don't have internal expertise in this area, hiring tax advisors and legal counsel who can help you through this transaction is critical. But some of those mitigation strategies that those advisors or your internal experts may be able to help you with are performing strong due diligence of the tax credit itself. So that includes the credit rate, that includes what the credit property is and making sure that property is eligible for the credit. And then with the IRA, there was an introduction of a few new concepts such as prevailing wage and apprenticeship, domestic content, and energy communities, which can add layer in additional complexity to quantifying that credit value. So you want to make sure someone's diligent in all of those areas. Then from an economic perspective, it's critical to have a strong indemnity supporting those credits and or a tax insurance provider giving you coverage for the economic risk of losing those credits through a disallowance, a recapture, or other challenge from the IRS. A couple of the other important mitigation strategies that are commonplace in this market are requiring a tax opinion and other formal memorandum documenting the value of the credits that you're purchasing and the elections and positions taken to claim those credits, and then receiving what's called required minimum documentation, which is included within the regulations as a requirement for the seller to provide the buyer with a set of documentation that really proves the existence of the credit eligible property.
Okay, so I'm interested in buying credits. What are my next steps?
That's great. So we suggest starting with the education phase first. That means gathering information about your tax liability, the different types of credits, and the process of purchasing tax credits. And that also includes engaging your internal stakeholders. So that's going to be your tax department, accounting, treasury, legal, and business development. Then we suggest engaging those external advisors that Ben had just mentioned. So that's your tax advisors and your legal counsel. And then finally, develop your strategy for purchase. That's going to be identifying your target source of credits, which could be direct negotiation with a seller, through a broker, a syndicator, or maybe a big bank. And then after that, you'll start evaluating potential opportunities along with those key stakeholders and advisors, and then you'll be on your way to purchasing credits and reducing your effective tax rate.
Terrific. Well, thank you, Jessica and Ben. Really interesting developments and hopefully driving a lot more sustainability efforts in our country as there's now a market for these credits. So really appreciate that overview in terms of how the credits transfer works and considerations for buyers. Well, and thank you guys for talking, but also thank you to our audience. Really appreciate you dialing in here and continuing the discussion on sustainability incentives. If you'd like more information, you could reach out to Jessica or Ben via LinkedIn. We also have a lot of information on the Deloitte Tax at Hand app. Just go to wherever you download your apps and download Tax at Hand and search on sustainability. There's lots of material there. As always, I hope you join us for our next discussion. Until then, I hope everyone continues to be well. Take care, everyone.